Slater Crusaders, welcome to the show. Glad you're here. Coming up, we're going to talk with Chris Ruffo from the Manhattan Institute. He just got back from some time on Skid Row and has some really sad but important insight from his time there. So we got that coming up. First, I want to talk about Bloomberg a little bit more. We talked yesterday a lot about this guy, and one of the main things we talked about is how this guy is an ego maniac. People say Trump has a giant ego, but Bloomberg is a more insidious version of it because he truly thinks that he's better than you. This is a clip of Mike Bloomberg at the Oxford Business School. The beginning of this clip, for some reason it's cut off. The beginning of the clip is, I can teach anybody. And he picks up there.
Anybody, even people in this room, so no offense intended, to be a farmer. It's a process. You dig a hole, you put a seed in, you put dirt on top, add water, up comes the corn. Then we had 300, you could learn that. Then you have 300 years of the industrial society. You put the piece of metal on the lathe, you turn the crank in the direction of the arrow, and you can have a job. And we created a lot of jobs. 98% of the world worked in agriculture. Today, it's 2% in the United States. Now comes the information economy. And the information economy is fundamentally different because it's built around replacing people with technology, and the skill sets that you have to learn are how to think and analyze. And that is a whole degree level different. You have to have a different skill set. You have to have a lot more gray matter.
Love that. I can't wait for farmers these next few days. Them farmers who don't have to think and analyze. Farming without all that thinking and analyzing. Bloomberg here is articulating as arrogantly as possible the difference between knowledge and wisdom. So Bloomberg thinks he has knowledge, right? He just articulated the textbook knowledge of how to make corn grow. Dig a hole, put a seed in it, put water on it, boom. Bada bing, bada boom, you got corn. But he has no wisdom. Wisdom is taking knowledge and knowing how and when to use it and apply it practically. Wisdom is earned through experience, which he clearly has none. People with wisdom are excellent at reflecting. They have a lot of compassion. They're always pursuing the truth. Philosophy literally means, the word philosophy means love of wisdom. Thomas Aquinas called wisdom the father of all the virtues. But the most important aspect of wisdom is humility, right? So we're talking about how Bloomberg's an egomaniac that there by definition lacks humility, therefore does not have wisdom. So the story goes, the oracle was asked, who is the wisest man in Greece? And the oracle said, Socrates. And Socrates said, whoa, hold on. I'm not wise at all. So what then does the oracle mean by saying that I'm the wisest? So he went on a journey to find men who were wiser than him, to prove the oracle wrong. So the first person that Socrates go to, he was a politician. And he said, my experience was something like this. I thought that he, the politician, appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. I then tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not. And as a result, he came to dislike me. So I withdrew and I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know. So I am likely to be wiser than he is, in that I do not think I know what I do not know. All right, so it's a lot. Wait, what? This politician thought that he was a genius in everything. But Socrates had the humility to say, you know what? I'm not sure about that topic. That thing you're asking me, like farming? I don't know as much about farming as, a farmer. And that humility makes Socrates wiser than the know-it-all politician. But Socrates, he wasn't going to stop there. He's like, all right, I'll just stop with the politician. I got to keep going. So I got to find the wisest man. So he went to, here's what he said. He said, and by the dog, gentlemen of the jury, for I must tell you the truth. I experienced something like this. In my investigation in the service of the god, the oracle, I found that those who had, and this is the key line, those who had the highest reputation for wisdom were nearly the most deficient, while those who were thought to be inferior, NASCAR fans, if I may, were in fact more knowledgeable. How good is that? And that's the famous William Buckley quote when he said, "I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone book than by the Harvard University faculty." This is why I'm not exaggerating. I would trust nearly anyone at the Daytona 500 to be in Congress over many of the people in DC who look down on the NASCAR fans, and that was Socrates' experience as well. Because I can't, even like right now as we're having this conversation, there's arrogant elitist people who are hearing this right now and thinking, oh, that's not true, Slater, come on. Socrates is wrong. I know more about things than NASCAR fans. They're not smart. And that's the point. You think you're smarter than NASCAR fans. Bloomberg, you think you're smarter than farmers. You think you can farm. You think you're an expert in one thing, and therefore you're an expert in all things, but you're not. Socrates goes on. He says, after the politicians, I went to the poets. And I'm ashamed, so it'd be like the intellectuals. And I'm ashamed to tell you the truth, gentlemen, but I must. I saw that because of their poetry, they thought themselves very wise men in other aspects which they were not. So Michael Bloomberg, he's good at one thing. Gosh, we think about this a lot with the Oscars too, right? Brad Pitt, you're a good actor. I guess he plays the same role in every single movie. But you're a good actor, so you think you can get up there and spout off about anything else? No, just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean you're good at something else. Bloomberg's good at one thing, right? Making his business. He's very good at that. Obviously, he's the richest man in New York City. Think about that. The richest man in all of New York City. But because he's good at that, he thinks, therefore, he can be a farmer too. It's easy, the hole, the seed, boom, you got your corn. Now here's the point, here's the thing, and this is Socrates' point. Bloomberg is good at making the Bloomberg terminal. That's how he got super rich, the Bloomberg terminal. It's a computer software system that analyzes market data. So he's smart, he did that. But he then also thinks that he would be a good farmer. Therefore, Bloomberg is not wise. Now, the farmer is excellent at growing corn. He's smart. It's hard to do that. He's smart. But the farmer doesn't think that he can make a computer software system that can analyze real-time market data. And the fact that the farmer knows he can't do that is what makes the farmer not just smart, but also wise. Make sense? That's what Socrates would say anyway. We'll wrap it up here. This is what he said. He said, finally, I went to the craftsmen, for I was conscious of knowing practically nothing. And I knew that I would find that they had knowledge in many fine things. We went to the artist. In this, I was not mistaken. They knew things I did not know. And to that extent, they were wiser than I. But, gentlemen of the jury, the good craftsman seemed to me to have the same fault as the poet. Each of them, because of his success in his craft, thought himself very wise in other most important pursuits. Oh, I love this line. And this air of theirs overshadowed the wisdom they had. So you're very wise, Mr. Craftsman, in whatever your craft is. You're a sculptor, right? You're a great sculptor. Wow. But the fact that you're so arrogant about everything else decreases the wisdom that you otherwise would have been able to claim. So Socrates, he went from politician to poet to craftsman. He went from politician to intellectual to artist, and found each of them to truly be not wise because they were arrogant. And I think this gets, again, to the root of something we've been touching on a lot here and there, and I promise you we're going to do a whole segment on this. It may take 2 segments to really break this down thoroughly, but it's the city-country divide. It's the ancient divide. It was super prevalent in 2016. It's going to be the same thing here today, especially if Mike Bloomberg continues to run. Because you couldn't get someone more elitist. So I think we mentioned this yesterday. Elizabeth Warren, her big Achilles heel is, what's her big Achilles heel? Inauthenticity, right? She's inauthentic. Oh, hey, husband, so glad you're here in my kitchen. Want to have a beer, right? It's like super inauthentic. And that's just like a killer when it comes to running for politics. And the other bad thing is being an elitist. And there is no bigger elitist than Mike Bloomberg. right? The richest man in New York City who thinks that you shouldn't drink soda. He knows better than you with what you should eat and drink. There's no bigger elitist. So when I think of this, it's like he embodies the city in the city versus country divide. He's the mayor of the biggest city in the country, for the love of Pete. Now, here's the truth. When I talk about the city versus country divide, I tend to speak about country life and country principles and values. I speak to them as if they're better because I agree with them, right? Well, again, we're gonna do this more later, but in short, in pretty much every movie, the good guys are from the country and the bad guys are from the city. Think about pretty much every movie. Luke Skywalker was just a farm boy. And the bad guys live in the Death Star. In the Hunger Games, Katniss lives not only in the country, but in the poorest district of all the districts. And where do the leaders live? They live in a place literally called Capital, a massive futuristic city where the people dress ridiculously. So you don't even have to know anything about the movie. You don't have to watch it. The movie could be on mute. And you know, look at like that. They're like, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in this movie? Right? Clearly, Katniss is the good guy, and those people, those clowns, are the bad guys. Braveheart, Mel Gibson's he's just a farmer. And who's the bad guy? The bad guy's the prince who lives in the castle, right? So it's not just me. Pop culture always has the good guys in the country and the bad guys in the city. But the truth is we need both. Where people in the city, like a Bloomberg, think that flyover country is worthless, who think that farming is simple. Dig a hole, put in a seed, corn grows. Kidding me? People in the city, like, who don't ever think about where their electricity comes from, or where their granite countertops come from, or how anything from wood is somehow magically appeared inside of the city. They don't even think about these things. And I'm easy to critique that, right? It's easy for me to critique that because, again, I agree more with the country principles and values. But that's not complete either, right? I, someone who agrees with the more country sensibilities, I also need to be grateful for the things that come out of cities, like the Bloomberg terminal and financial markets, and like drag queen story hour, and things that come out of cities. Come on. What are good things that come out of cities? Rats. Cities have a lot of rats. Who would calculate crime data if we didn't have cities? So, listen, I'm not exactly sure what good things come out of cities, but I'm sure there's something. And that's all Socrates is saying, that we need to appreciate what each culture and what each type of economy brings to the table to make one cohesive country. Proverbs 11:2, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, we're going to talk with Chris Ruffo next about homelessness in Skid Row. But homelessness doesn't even begin to describe the situation there. So we'll do that coming up next year. First, I want to talk about the illusory truth effect. This is why people believe fake news, among other things. So a couple weeks ago, The Verge, online magazine, they wrote an article about people who work at Facebook and YouTube, and their job is to root out the worst content. Right, so these people, they spend their time sitting in front of the computer and they just dig into just like the most toxic, horrible, violent rabbit holes, and they go headfirst into them and they get rid of just the worst content, the videos, the pictures, and that's their job. And the subheadline was, these moderators, they keep Facebook and YouTube free from violent extremism, and now some of them have PTSD. And pretty horrific stories from these people who just have to sit there and watch this stuff for 6 hours a day. But the article, these people also, they have to get rid of conspiracy theories that are out there online, right? They have to rid YouTube and Facebook of conspiracy theories. But the thing is, and this is the most interesting part of the article, after a while, these people started to believe the very things that they were trying to root out. So you take someone who is does not believe 9/11 was an inside job, and you put them in this job for a couple weeks, couple months, and pretty soon they're like, you know what? I think 9/11 was an inside job, actually. They start to believe that. After a while, they're like, yeah, Sandy Hook, that was definitely CIA was in on that one. Like, wait, what? How do you, how? And some of these moderators, they become super paranoid and they feared for their safety. And it's a great example, a bad example, unfortunate example, but of garbage in, garbage out, right? They sit there for 6 hours a day and they're just input just this garbage, and eventually they start to believe it. So that's the illusory truth effect. The very simple line, if you hear something enough times, you'll start to believe it, right? If you hear something enough times, you'll start to believe it's true. And it turns out that that's actually true. The simple power of repetition. So on my radio show the other day, a couple weeks ago, we talked about why pop music is so terrible. We talked about the science behind why pop music is terrible. And if you think back on the most popular pop songs of the summer, right? Can't Stop the Feeling by Justin Timberlake or whatever, right? Or a Bruno Mars song, whatever. When you first heard that song, you probably didn't like it. But once you hear it enough, once they start playing it in the mall, they play it at the grocery store, once you start seeing it on TV commercials and on the NFL, when they go in and out of commercial or whatever, you hear the song enough and enough. And once some friend says they like it or some other trusted authority says that it's a good song, then you start to like it. And that's called brainwashing. And you watch some commercial, there's some product on TV, and you're like, oh, that's stupid. But you see that commercial enough times, and you just end up buying it. Similarly, there's certain factoids that we just sort of pick up along our lives, and we just hang on to them, and we never question them. Just some silly ones. I always thought that when your foot falls asleep, that you're cutting off circulation. You're cutting off blood circulation to your foot. I always thought that my whole life, but that's not true. Otherwise, your foot would turn blue and you'd have to amputate it, right? You can't just cut off blood circulation to your foot for an hour. But I heard it was that, and I just never questioned it. I just went with it. And I remember the first time someone told me it's not that, and I got all defensive. I was like, what are you talking about? Of course it's that. Or the factoid that we use 10% of our brain. We've all heard that. It's not true. Even the word factoid. I always thought that factoid meant a little fact, like a little tiny, silly fact. But it actually means a false statement. So it's a factoid is the opposite of a fact. But I heard it enough times. I heard the word factoid used enough times in a certain way, so I just went with that and took it as fact. So the technical term for what I was just describing here, the technical term is frequency and the conference of referential validity, whatever. There's a study done in the 70s. This is what they did. They took a group of college students, and they gave them a test with 60 true or false questions. Very, objectively true or false questions. So the largest museum in the world is the Louvre in Paris. True or false, right? Questions like that. But they weren't just asked these questions one time. They were given 3 different tests over a 2-week period. So they got the 60 questions the first time. Then they come back a couple days later and they have 60 more questions. The first 10 questions were different and the last 10 questions were different, but the middle 40 were sprinkled in some of the same questions from the first week, right? So some of the questions were repeated. And here's what they found. They did that for 3 weeks. The questions that were repeated, the students became more certain that something was true each time that they were asked that same question, right? So they became more confident the more they heard the statement. Whether it was true or false didn't matter. The more they heard it, the more they believed it was true. Make sense? So there's another study that proves that it's not just how often you hear something, right? Again, the more often you hear it, the more likely you're to think it's true. But it's also how something sounds in our brain. Or in this case, how something rhymes. It's called processing fluency. I think of it like your brain is like a castle, and there's these guards outside the castle gates, and they let certain things through and some things they don't let through. If something sounds sweet, if something rhymes, your brain guards are more likely to let it through. So they would take an expression, birds of a feather flock together. we all are more likely to say that that statement is true than we are birds of a feather flock conjointly. Same thing, right? Same point, but one sounds nicer, and it like lulls the guards outside of your brain to sleep, and we let it go right through because it sounds nice. They were given the sentence, what sobriety conceals, alcohol reveals. And people heard that and they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, been there. But then people were given the sentence, what sobriety conceals, alcohol unmasks. And people were like, no, that's not necessarily true, right? So we accepted the rhyming sentence. We all do this. We accept the rhyming sentence easier. It's more pleasing sound to our brain, so we let it pass the guards into our brain, right? But we provide way more scrutiny to the sentence that doesn't rhyme. So there's two things here, right? When we hear things over and over and over again, people start to think it's true. Another example, 57% of Americans think that crime has gotten worse since 2008, but it's actually gone down quite a bit in the last 12 years. So why do many people think it's crime's gone up? Because we hear about it on the news all the time. All we hear in the news, nonstop. Bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, crime, 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 crime. We think crime's going up. And we also hear things that sound pleasing, like literally pleasing to our ear, like a rhyming phrase. And so pleasing in that regard, but also anything that confirms our previously held beliefs also sound very nice to us. So we're more likely to allow that in as well. So there's not the breakthrough here with what I just shared there. I just want to share that because just so we know there's science behind that. And to make it relevant to today and yesterday's main topics, actually, we had two main topics yesterday, and this fits pretty nicely with both of them. It fits really nicely with everything you hear all the time in the news, but yesterday we talked about Bloomberg and coronavirus. Right? What two topics are inundating the media right now? You got Bloomberg buying ads nonstop, and you have coronavirus threats leading every single newscast. So just focus on Bloomberg for the sake of time. After a while with Bloomberg, right? So when I first heard Bloomberg, it was like, especially to most people, like I kind of know the name because I used to live in New York and whatever. And I'm like, this is my job, is to pay attention to this stuff. But I think most people were like, Bloomberg, who, like what? Like he's a nobody, and then you kind of hear that he's running, right? And then you're like, oh yeah, he's running. And then before you know it, he's the front runner. Like front runner. And I don't even know if he is the front runner, but everyone thinks he's the front runner all of a sudden. Everyone's talking and acting like he is the front runner, and then people start saying he's the front runner. And I just said he's the front runner, but as soon as I said that, I was like, well, I don't even know if he really is the front runner. I haven't seen any polls that say he's the front runner. He's literally done nothing. He has nothing. He hasn't been to a debate. No one's voted for him. And now he's the front runner all of a sudden? Who said he's the front runner? I don't know, but someone did, and I accepted it. I'm like, well, now he is. And the more people start talking about like he is the front runner, the more people are going to accept that. Be like, oh yeah, he's definitely the front runner. Who said? So the big question with Bloomberg is, he's using this technique, right? He's using the illusory truth technique. Can Bloomberg trick people into thinking he's the front runner? Can he trick enough people into thinking he's the front runner that people vote for him because they think everyone else is voting for him too? Does that make sense? So maybe you have like your average, more moderate voter. Obviously you got your Bernie supporters, right? Whatever. But your more average, kind of moderate Democratic voter, whatever, and they're kind of undecided, and they don't really know what to do. They just want to beat Trump, right? It's top priority. And Bloomberg just bought his way into the conversation. Everywhere you look, right? The Bloomberg everywhere. But has he done that enough where people are like, I gotta vote for Bloomberg. Everyone else is. He's the front runner. I gotta vote for the front runner. I want to win. I need someone who's gonna win. And if everyone's getting behind Bloomberg because he's the front runner, then I gotta vote for him too. Can he trick enough people into thinking that that's the case? I don't know, we'll see. Big picture point beyond Bloomberg. Question everything all the time. Question everything you hear. Question every belief you have. Because you, everyone, we've all fallen victim to this illusory truth effect. And if you think you haven't, then you definitely have. This ties into the Socrates segment that we just did a couple minutes ago. Only when you know you are influenced by this effect can you begin to actually not be affected by it. Question everything, which is what we're going to do next with our next guest when it comes to homelessness. We're told that homelessness is a housing problem. We've been told that for years, for decades, by the left. Housing. And it has nothing to do with housing. Question everything. We'll do that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Cider Crusaders. So we talk quite a bit about homelessness. We have on my radio show here in San Diego, and we're going to here on the TV show as well. It's a huge problem, and the president's going to get involved and all this. So we'll talk about all this. But I want to go talk right now to Christopher Ruffo from the City Journal, who just spent some time in Skid Row, which is like the epicenter of it all. Christopher, how are you, brother?
Very well.
Good, man. I want to ask you what you saw. But why do this? Why'd you even go? And why are you passionate about this topic at all?
Yeah, so I've been doing a series of articles over the last 18 months about homelessness in West Coast cities. And I thought it was time to really dig in and, as you said, go to the epicenter of the problem in Los Angeles, in Skid Row. And what I saw there was really shocking. You have to consider that there are 59,000 people sleeping on the streets, in tents, cars, and emergency shelters in Los Angeles County. This is an unprecedented number, and I wanted to understand what's really happening and what's causing this crisis.
What did you see?
You know, I saw a bit of everything. I saw some really desperate situations. Actually, on Skid Row. Skid Row is about a 5 by 10 block area. It's very small. But it's home every year to more than 10,000 homeless intravenous drug users. And I saw a bit of everything. I saw people smoking meth in the streets. I saw people fighting. I saw people, engaged in all kinds of just horrific situations. And it's all right there, plain to see. Anyone can go down there. And it's really a human crisis. And unfortunately, the rhetoric that we've been hearing from political leaders is that it's just a housing problem. But judging from what I saw on Skid Row, it's much deeper than that. It can't simply be solved simply by building housing.
No, it's almost, I don't want to get to all that, but it's almost such an absurd premise. I mean, you take people who are in the depths of an addiction that they've had for decades and you throw them behind some door and you think that their life is what's suddenly going to turn around. That's ridiculous. I want to get to that though, but I've never been to Skid Row. Is there anything going on there? Like, are there any businesses? Is there any other reason to go there at all other than to be homeless, right?
Yeah, Skid Row's, it's kind of interesting. So you have still the garment district in LA. You have some predominantly Asian import-export businesses. So you'll see sometimes, kind of Asian American shopkeepers rolling up their doors, working a full day, rolling the doors down, and then shortly after that, people just slumped across their doorways. So there is still some kind of low-rent industry there, which surprised me. But the dominant industry there is social services. You have hundreds of nonprofit organizations, thousands of subsidized housing units. You have so many different kind of social service functions concentrated in this tiny area, which has a paradoxical effect. You're trying to deliver services, but in fact, Skid Row is probably one of the most difficult places to improve your life in the country. So you're trying to deliver services while at the same time, life on the streets really simply just drags people down.
Wow, that's such a good point. Let's talk about the housing real quick. So to explain to everyone, because I'm here in California, you're in Seattle, all we hear about is housing, nonstop all the time. So people in the rest of the country, help everyone understand how that is an issue, but has nothing to do with this issue.
Yeah, so obviously housing prices in superstar cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, San Diego, they've gone up tremendously in the last 10 years. That puts pressure on everyone, especially people at the lower end of the income scale. But the data on homelessness is clear. In San Francisco, for example, only 11% of people who are homeless report having any work over the course of 1 year. And if you simply divide it and estimate, you could probably estimate that it's only a few percentage of people that are employed full-time throughout the year among the homeless population. So in a way, you have to get people able to earn an income, able to be independent, able to support themselves before they can even think about, well, what is the rent this month? So I think you have to really approach it that way. Obviously, if you are homeless, addicted, unemployed, San Francisco, Seattle, at Los Angeles is probably a very difficult place to make it because it's so expensive. But you really have to treat those human issues first. You have to figure out what is preventing this person from full engagement with the world? What is preventing this person from being self-sufficient and independent if they're potentially able to be? And that's the issue that, unfortunately, political leaders in West Coast cities really want to sidestep, because they want to look at it as an infrastructure problem. They want to be there at the ribbon cutting on a new kind of housing development. And these other problems are much more difficult, and they frankly don't have an answer.
Yeah, really good. Okay, I want to get to the politicians in a minute too, but let's go deeper, right? So the surface that we all hear about is housing. It's a housing problem, but it's not that, okay? So if we go a little deeper, I think you get the argument that it's like an addiction problem. And there's truth to that. Can you speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah, so the California Policy Lab at UCLA just released a report that dovetails with evidence that I've seen and collected, that roughly 75 to 78% of people who are unsheltered have a serious addiction and or a mental illness. So I think those are really the two primary ingredients of this problem, where you have addiction. In Seattle, it's predominantly heroin and opiates. As you get further south towards Los Angeles, it's primarily methamphetamine. So you have a heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamine crisis that makes people truly unable to function at a high level. And on top of that, you have serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder that affect many of the people on the streets. And unfortunately, those two things actually go hand in hand in many cases. So in San Francisco, for example, of the total homeless or unstably housed population, which is about 18,000 people, 4,000 of them, 4,000 of those folks have a serious mental illness and a serious addiction. So you're dealing with something that is very difficult. You're homeless, you're addicted, you're mentally ill. And that is really what's at bottom. That's the most difficult social question that we're facing.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you're finally identifying what is the root of this stuff. Because as you said, politicians don't even want to touch it at all. So let's go even deeper, right? And I guess maybe a mental illness is mental illness and addiction, they're two kind of different things, but maybe we'll focus on addiction. So you have a lack of housing, like that's not really it. It's addiction, but then even deeper, what causes addiction? Obviously, everyone's got a different story, but just in your experience and the people you've talked to on Skid Row, at social services, and everything, what do they say is the root cause of the addiction?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of theories, there's a lot of evidence that points in many different ways, but I think that if you want to boil it down to one fundamental idea, you have essentially a shredding of the social fabric at the bottom of society in the United States. And I think that when you've lost the institutions of family, faith institutions, community institutions, stable work and employment institutions, when all of those essential building blocks of human life are shredded, you're left with a void. And unfortunately, at least in my observations, in places like Skid Row, Pioneer Square, the Tenderloin in San Francisco, when those things are gone, what fills the void is despair, violence, and addiction, frankly. So you have people, if you talk to the actual folks on Skid Row, almost all of them, not all of them, there are certainly exceptions, but almost all of the people that I talk to, I mean, if you ask about their life, it's really not a surprise that they're with an addiction, because their life stories are heartbreaking, are tragic, very difficult. And I think a lot of the reason why you didn't see this, 50 or 100 years ago in this kind of scale, and you don't see this now in other countries, is frankly because we've shredded community institutions for poor and vulnerable people in the United States.
Can you give us an example of a story you heard, or someone, or you can one person specific, or you can put a bunch of them together and give us a nice amalgam? But walk us through maybe someone's life that would lead to this on Skid Row.
Yeah, I talked to one woman when I was on Skid Row who had been born and raised in New Orleans, and then when Hurricane Katrina hit, she penniless got on a bus to Los Angeles and found herself homeless, and has been in and out of homelessness ever since. She has a daughter who, also has an addiction, also in and out of homelessness, lost custody of her child. And these are the kind of human stories. And I met her. She was, spent more than a decade on the streets, and she said, "Yeah, I'm just waiting for the government to provide me an apartment." And your heart breaks because you want to see her life improve, and you know that it's really a scandal of public leadership that someone could be on the streets for 10 years, while at the same time you don't know exactly how to help because it's a very entrenched situation. There's probably even more to the story than you get in just a short conversation, but I think that is emblematic of so many of the stories that you find on the streets of Skid Row.
Yeah, it is pretty wild that it's never been anything like this to scale. And you mentioned other countries. So is there anything like this in other countries? I don't have the perspective.
So, I mean, there's a lot of countries, so we can't go through them one by one, but I would say that in, kind of cutting against the grain, right? So if you look at Europe, for example, many American liberals and progressives look towards Europe and they say, Europe is so much better because they have a large government, ample public programs, high rates of public spending. And that's why Europe is a great country, or a great continent with many great countries. But in my experience, I'm an Italian citizen, spent a lot of time in Italy. It's not that in Italy, for example, the public spending is higher and therefore, the society is better. It's because the actual organic social institutions are much more functional, especially for people lower down the income ladder. So you have strong families, you have very tight-knit local communities, and you have norms that enforce certain types of behavior. So for example, in my village in Italy, there are people that are mentally ill. There are people that have drug addictions, but they're embraced by the community, and their behavior is essentially limited by some restraints that are cultural in nature. But if you look at Skid Row or the Tenderloin in San Francisco, it's a normalist society in the sense of traditional norms. And people essentially export the problem there. It's like from around the country, all of these homelessness problems get exported to these neighborhoods, and they can live there in a kind of normless and lawless world. And I think it's a huge tragedy. And I really firmly believe, after having looked at this for a couple years now, that the deepest problem is social, and it's the loss of those social institutions.
Wow, really good. So are you familiar with Mark Manson, the writer?
Say it one more time.
Mark Manson. Are you familiar with Mark Manson?
I'm not, no.
Yeah, he has a new book coming out. Oh, so the last segment we just did, we talked about questioning everything. Like, question everything you've ever heard, question all these expressions that we've just picked up throughout our life, that we just accept as true but aren't necessarily. And he has a new book coming out. I just read this yesterday, and it's about how the nuclear family is not the ideal. The nuclear family is kind of a new concept, and it's not necessarily the best. And I immediately reject that. I'm like, no, a nuclear family is the best. What are you talking about? And I haven't read the book, but then I read on a little bit of his description, and he says, well, we used to have much more of a tribal family situation. And I think that's kind of what you mentioned, like in Italy, right? Where it's not just your nuclear family, but the whole family is in the community, and the whole community is tied together. And that social cohesiveness is incredibly powerful, and I think we're losing that in America. Is that trending? Is that about right?
So sorry, I'm sick. But yeah, I think that is right. And if you study the history of the family in the United States and the Western world, the nuclear family was really the second to last stop before what we think of as family breakdown. You had, since really the dawn of industrialization, the end of feudalism, you had these large families that have gotten progressively smaller, and smaller. We idealize the nuclear family because it's what's in kind of our common memory. We have a kind of heyday of the nuclear family, 1950s, 1960s image. And in many ways, of course, it's better than having no families or broken families or scattered families. But the loss is a historical loss that has been going on for, at this point, hundreds of years. And I think that if you look at Skid Row as perhaps, in a suggestive way, the end point of that, when you've lost all family, you've lost all community bonds, you've lost all social ties, Skid Row is the place that you end up. And I think it's a very dark omen towards the future, that if we are unable to somehow remake those bonds, those family and community bonds, Are there going to be Skid Rows in every town in the United States? Is that going to be the fate for people who are born without families, without connections?
Wow, unbelievable. Chris, we're super late. Can we stick around and just do one more quick segment about like what suggestions on what to do next? Is that okay?
Sure.
Coming up next, we got more from Christopher Ruffo from the City Journal. Coming up more next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Cider Crusaders. Awesome insight here from Christopher Ruffo at City Journal. Been working really hard about homelessness and has an amazing piece out now and a great video to go along with it as well called The Moral Crisis of Skid Row. Christopher, thanks for sticking around. So real quick before we get to solutions, why do you call it a moral crisis? I think it's so important to frame it this way and not an economic. That was a major problem from conservatives especially, but from everyone who making it like no businesses can pop up if there's a bunch of homeless people around. It's like, oh, like that's missing the point here. So why do you call it a moral crisis?
So on one level, if you look at in the homeless population, it's a moral crisis. I mean, these are moral issues that they're confronting every day. To be on the streets is tremendously difficult. You're faced with moral challenges. There are high rates of crime, high rates of prostitution, high rates of drug abuse. And not only from my perspective, but if you really talk to people, they're feeling a sense of kind of moral breakdown, moral crisis, and then they're reaching out in a moral way for some help and some human connection. At the same time, it's a moral crisis for the leadership class, the people at the top, which in West Coast cities are predominantly progressive political leaders, because they've essentially failed to address this problem in a meaningful way for decades. And I think it's a moral scandal, and the people at the top have somehow evaded accountability, but it's really up to the public to kind of pin the tail on these folks and say, it's not okay to have 59,000 people who are homeless in Los Angeles County. Get something done, start making some changes, or we're going to vote you out.
Yeah, that's right. Give us one example of what not to do, right? So what are these progressive politicians done for all these years? Or maybe new things that they're coming up with that you're like, no, you guys are way off, that's not gonna work at all. You're gonna make it worse.
Yeah, I think the number one thing, and this is really the key, the strategy that most cities are pursuing and have pursued for a while, that is an absolute failure, is centralization. So what I mean by that is they've decided to centralize homelessness and homelessness services and homelessness housing in one location in the city. So it's Skid Row in Los Angeles, it's the Tenderloin in San Francisco, it's Pioneer Square in Seattle. And the problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, when you're trying to deliver services and housing in an area that has a heavy concentration of street homelessness, crime, availability of drugs, gang activity in the case of Skid Row, it's almost impossible for people to make changes in that environment. You know, I talked to many addicts and former addicts. They said, I could never get clean in Skid Row. So then why are we concentrating and centralizing all of our services in that neighborhood? It's counterproductive, and what it ends up doing is you're creating a permanent social service bureaucracy. You're guaranteeing jobs for thousands and thousands of social service workers in the public sector, but you're not having very good outcomes and actually helping people get back on their feet.
Yeah. Okay, give us one or two things that are not being done or talked about that you think we should do.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, immediately, today, tomorrow, in the next 60 days, cities like Los Angeles should construct enough FEMA-style emergency shelter to get people off the streets, to triage them, figure out what's going on, what are their biggest issues, and then connect them with the dispersed services, reconnect them with family. If they're from out of town, offer them a ticket to go back home where they might be able to get care. So build FEMA-style emergency shelters first and foremost. Second, devote the tremendous amount of public resources towards an emergency style approach, because you can't promise to build housing 10 years from now. You actually have to deal with the problem now. So I hope to see the local, state, federal government devoting resources to treat this like an emergency, like it's a flood or an earthquake, because that's really what's happening. It's a social and cultural earthquake that we have to address now before it's too late.
That's right. Last question. Is there anything that President Trump can do? And by I say President Trump, I mean the federal government, or is there nothing there?
That's tough. I know that there are plans and discussions happening right now with Secretary Carson and the president's team. But I think at the end of the day, the federal government can offer support, can offer resources, can transfer money from the emergency system. But I think at the end of the day, it's truly a local problem, and local policy really dictates what happens. And the federal government can pour in money, they can fly in helicopters with resources and facilities. But until local city and county governments change their policies, I'm afraid that it won't do much good.
Yeah, and unfortunately, all these cities are just doubling down on these same failed policies and the same politicians. Pretty amazing. Christopher Ruffo, man, thanks for all this insight. Keep up the awesome work. Where can people read this and everything else that you've done on this topic?
Sure, just Google City Journal Skid Row, and it should pop up as the first result.
Beautiful. Christopher Ruffo, let's talk again, brother. Keep up the great work.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you. Slater Crusaders, we're out of time. Got to go. We'll see you tomorrow. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.